The world of the internet was an endless rabbit hole, and Rachel had plunged deep into its darkest corners. It started as a curiosity, an idle fascination with the forbidden, a peek into the shadowy world of the deep web. She didn't want to buy drugs or stolen goods. She wasn't looking for hitmen or hacking services. She just wanted to see how far humanity's depravity could go. Her friends had warned her about it. "Don't go looking for trouble," her roommate Mara had said, laughing nervously as Rachel dismissed her concerns. "People have disappeared doing what you're doing. I'm serious. Don't let curiosity get you killed." But Rachel had always been the type to push boundaries. "It's just the internet," she replied. "What's the worst that could happen?" The chat room she stumbled upon was called The Human Touch. Its description read, "Experience the truest form of human connection." Rachel assumed it was some edgy commentary about loneliness in the digital age, but as soon as she clicked on it, she realized it was something far darker. The chat room wasn't lively like the forums or video streams she'd encountered on the deep web. Instead, it was eerily quiet, like an abandoned house filled with whispers. Posts floated in the void, written in cryptic, almost poetic phrases. They spoke of the sensation of touch as something profound, something sacred, and disturbingly, something dangerous. She scrolled through the entries, her curiosity mounting. Ma'am, there is no purer intimacy than the press of skin to skin, uninvited. The touch of a stranger can be salvation or a curse. Do you know the difference? Some hands heal, others take. Which will yours be? One post stopped her dead in her tracks. Would you trade your safety for connection? Would you trade your life for a touch? Rachel's heart raced. She typed back impulsively. "It's just a touch. What's the worst that could happen?" Seconds later, a private message popped up. The user's name was Salvatore, and their profile picture was blank. "Would you like to find out?" A shiver ran down her spine, but the thrill of the unknown overpowered her unease. Was this a social experiment? A prank? She typed back quickly, trying to sound fearless. "Sure, why not?" Salvatore responded almost immediately. "Write your name on a piece of paper, hold it, and wait." Rachel smirked at the absurdity. Grabbing a sticky note, she scrawled her name in messy letters and held it in her hand. For a moment, she felt ridiculous. Nothing happened. A minute passed, then another. Just as she was about to type a snarky response back, her phone vibrated. It wasn't a notification. This was different. The vibrations felt oddly rhythmic, like a pulse. She turned her phone over, her breath catching in her throat. The screen was blank, but the phone's surface felt warm, almost alive. And then she felt it, a faint, undeniable pressure against her palm. It was as if fingers were curling around hers. She yelped and dropped the phone, backing away from the table. The vibrations stopped instantly. The phone lay still, as if nothing had happened. Her laptop chimed. A new message from Salvatore appeared. "I touched you." Rachel's stomach flipped. Her mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe her phone was malfunctioning? Maybe she was imagining things. "How did you do that?" she typed, her fingers trembling. The reply came instantly. "Would you like to feel it again?" No. Too late. The pressure on her arm came suddenly. At first she thought it was her imagination, but it grew stronger, undeniable. It felt cold and clammy, like fingers trailing down her forearm. She jumped from her chair, swatting at the invisible force, but it didn't stop. The sensation multiplied, like dozens of hands gripping her arms, her neck, her waist. Her scream echoed through the empty apartment. She bolted out of her room, her mind racing for answers. Was someone in the house? Was this some advanced prank? She locked herself in the bathroom, her chest heaving. Her phone vibrated again. Against her better judgment, she glanced at the screen. "You invited me." The bathroom light flickered. The faint sensation of touch returned, creeping across her shoulders. It wasn't just a feeling now. It was weight. Something was pressing on her, suffocating her. Through her panic, she remembered the chat room's description. experience the truest form of human connection. She didn't know what she had agreed to, but this was no connection she wanted. She grabbed her phone and typed furiously, "Stop! Please, stop!" The reply came almost instantly. "You need to understand, every touch has a price." The pressure on her body released abruptly, leaving her gasping for air. For a moment she thought it was over, but then she noticed her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Handprints. Dark, bruise-like marks in the shape of hands covered her arms and shoulders. Her phone buzzed again. "You'll carry me with you now, forever." She deleted the app, shut off her phone, and stayed in the bathroom for hours. When she finally emerged, she convinced herself it had been a nightmare. A cruel prank, some elaborate hoax. But that night, as she lay in bed, the sensation returned. Fingers trailing across her skin, pressing into her chest, wrapping around her throat. The marks multiplied. No matter where she went or how far she ran, she couldn't escape the phantom touches. They grew stronger, more invasive. She could feel them when she was awake, when she was asleep, even in public. And with each new mark, she received a message from Salvatore. "You wanted to know. Now you do." Rachel stopped responding, but it didn't matter. She couldn't make it stop. No one else could see the bruises, but they covered her body, a map of her torment. Her only company was the constant, suffocating sensation of hands dragging her deeper into isolation and despair. She tried everything to escape it. She moved cities, burned her laptop, even replaced her phone. But it didn't matter. Wherever she went, the touches followed. Finally, in a moment of desperation, she returned to the deep web, back to the human touch. The chat room was empty now, except for one message pinned to the top. "The truest connection is one you can never let go." Rachel's trembling fingers hovered over the keyboard. She didn't want to reply, but the weight on her shoulders was unbearable. The sensation of fingers squeezing her arms almost broke her resolve. She typed a single, desperate plea. "What do you want from me?" The answer came instantly, cold and final. "To remind you what it feels like to be touched." The lights in her room flickered and went out. In the dark, the hands found her again, stronger this time. And this time, they didn't let go. The first time Caroline felt it, she dismissed it as exhaustion. A fleeting pressure, barely perceptible, brushing against the back of her hand as she scrolled through the dim glow of her phone late at night. She glanced down reflexively, expecting to see the loose sleeve of her hoodie or the edge of a blanket. But there was nothing. Just her hand, still and alone, the faint tingling warmth of something. Absent. She shook it off, swiped away the Bitcoin app she'd been obsessively monitoring, and reminded herself to sleep. But even as her head hit the pillow, the sensation lingered, a prickling heat on her skin, as though a hand had just pulled away. She stared at the dark ceiling until exhaustion finally dragged her under. Caroline wasn't a tech enthusiast. She barely understood the concept of cryptocurrency when Danny first explained it to her 6 months ago. The term blockchain sounded like gibberish, and wallets were something she thought you used for cash. But Danny had painted it differently. A thriving underground economy where the rules were rewritten, where anonymity was king, and where money moved faster than governments could regulate it. At first she thought it was all illegal. Drug trades, arms deals. He laughed and said, no, it wasn't about crime. It was about freedom. There was a thrill in it she couldn't deny. And when he invited her to join a private forum called The Network, she reluctantly accepted. The work started small. A package here, a USB drop there. She told herself it was harmless. She wasn't hurting anyone. She was just a courier. The payouts grew bigger. And the clients? Stranger. The ad was like a joke at first. Blood for Bitcoin, it read, the words set against a black background with a pixelated drop of red. Beneath it, a single line of text. Do not apply unless referred. Caroline had rolled her eyes and scrolled past, but curiosity got the better of her. She opened the ad again, staring at it longer this time. "What is this?" she asked Danny over a beer a few days later. He glanced at her phone and froze. "Where did you see that?" "On the network," she said. "Why?" He set his bottle down slowly. "Forget it. You don't want to get involved with those guys." That should have been her first warning, but the payout was impossible to ignore. The ad offered 3.5 Bitcoin, nearly $120,000. All for 1 hour. 1 hour in a locked room. Danny tried to warn her again when she brought it up. "Caroline, I'm serious. These aren't the same people you've been dealing with. They don't just trade in money. They're into weirder stuff." "Weirder how?" she pressed. "Just stay away from it, okay?" But she didn't. The house looked abandoned, its shutters clinging desperately to the splintering wood. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the mailbox hung open, its rusted hinge barely clinging to the post. The neighborhood felt off. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead. The kind of silence that presses down on you, thick and suffocating, making every footstep sound louder than it should. Caroline checked the address again, her phone trembling in her hand. This was the place. Her instructions had been explicit. Knock 3 times, wait 10 seconds, and enter. No additional details, no contact names. Just the promise of payment and the assurance that everything was safe. Her heart thudded in her chest as she raised her hand. The sound of her knuckles striking the wood echoed unnaturally in the stillness. 1, 2, 3. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then with a soft click, the door creaked open. "Hello?" she called, peering into the dimly lit corridor. No response. The air inside was heavy, damp, and faintly metallic. She hesitated on the threshold, every instinct screaming at her to leave, but she forced herself forward. The door closed behind her with a hollow thud. The hallway stretched on longer than it should have, the shadows pooling unnaturally around the corners. At the end, a door stood slightly ajar, marked with a strange, angular symbol carved into the wood. The grooves glistened faintly, as though freshly etched. She stepped closer, her footsteps muffled by the thick, threadbare carpet. The room beyond the door was small, almost suffocating. A single chair sat in the center, surrounded by intricate patterns drawn on the floor in white chalk. The lines twisted and coiled like veins, converging at the base of the chair. Candles lined the room, their flames unnaturally still despite the faint draft. Their light flickered against the walls, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Sit," a voice instructed. She froze. The voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried an edge that left no room for disobedience. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Sit," it repeated. Her legs moved before her mind could object. She sank into the chair, the wood cold and unyielding beneath her. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she felt it, the touch. It started at the nape of her neck, light and teasing, like a cold breath against her skin. She flinched, her hands shooting up to brush it away, but there was nothing there. Then it came again, firmer this time, trailing down her spine. Her body stiffened. She wanted to move, to stand, to run, but she was frozen. "Remain still," the voice said, closer now, almost at her ear. The sensations spread, fingers pressing into her shoulders, her arms, her thighs. They moved with eerie precision, exploring her skin as though cataloging every inch. It wasn't painful, but it wasn't gentle either. It felt clinical, possessive. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing it to stop, but the touch only grew stronger. It was everywhere now, dozens of hands, pressing, gripping, claiming. When the hour finally ended, the door creaked open and the sensations vanished. She bolted from the chair, her body trembling, her skin alive with the memory of those hands. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. The payment had been received. She ran. Caroline told herself it was over, that whatever had happened in that house was finished. But the touches didn't stop. At first, they were faint, phantom brushes against her skin, a pressure that disappeared the moment she noticed it. She rationalized it as stress, as paranoia, but then they grew stronger. They followed her everywhere, in the shower, at work, even in crowded streets. Invisible hands gripped her wrists, stroked her face, tangled in her hair. She started wearing long sleeves, gloves, anything to create a barrier, but it didn't help. The bruises came next. Dark, finger-shaped marks that appeared overnight, spreading across her arms and legs like a map of her torment. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating. She tried to contact Danny, but he wouldn't answer her calls. Desperation drove her back to the house. No one knows what happened to Caroline. When authorities arrived, they found the house empty, save for the faint glow of dying candles and the outlines of handprints burned into the walls. Her phone lay in the center of the room, open to a final transaction. The title read, "Blood for Bitcoin, 6 BTC." Underneath, a single comment, "Paid in full. It's..." The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Dana froze mid-step, her breath caught in her throat. The old apartment building had its quirks, pipes that groaned, wood that creaked. But this was different. This was deliberate. She glanced at the clock on the wall, 2:43 a.m., far too late for neighbors to be wandering around. Her fingertips brushed the cool porcelain of her coffee mug as she steadied herself. She convinced herself it was nothing, just the wind or the building settling. But when she turned back to the kitchen sink, she felt it. A soft, warm brush against her elbow, fleeting but unmistakable. Her heart stuttered. There was no one there. Donna had moved to the city 2 weeks ago, eager to escape the monotony of small-town life. Her new apartment was old but charming, with a fire escape that overlooked a bustling street below. She enjoyed the noise, the hum of life that followed her even into the solitude of her home. The landlord had been quick to rent it out, smiling a little too widely as he handed her the keys. "It's been sitting empty for a while," he said. "You'll love it. Lots of character." He didn't mention why it had been vacant for so long, and Dana didn't ask. At first, she chalked up the strange sensations to the stress of moving. The misplaced keys, the flickering lights, the cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. But as the days went on, the apartment started to feel less like home and more like a trap. It started with the touch, a gentle brush of air on the back of her neck when no windows were open. The feeling of fingers grazing hers as she reached for the light switch. It wasn't constant, but it was enough to make her uneasy. One evening, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, she felt something slide across the back of her hand. She jerked away, her phone clattering to the floor. There was no one there. Her reflection in the darkened TV screen caught her attention. For a split second, she thought she saw a shadow move behind her. She spun around, her heart pounding, but the apartment was empty. The next morning, she found her phone lying in the hallway. She didn't remember leaving it there. The touches became more frequent. They weren't just brushes of air anymore. They lingered. At night, Dana would wake to the feeling of hands resting on her legs, her arms, her chest. She couldn't see them, but the pressure was unmistakable. She would lie frozen, too afraid to move, until the sensation eventually faded. One night, she woke to the sound of soft breathing. It wasn't hers. She sat up, clutching the blankets to her chest, and stared into the darkness. The breathing stopped. She turned on the bedside lamp, but the room was empty. Empty, except for the handprints smeared on her bedroom mirror. Determined not to let her imagination get the best of her, Dana invited her friend Alex over the following weekend. Alex was the kind of person who never took anything seriously, which was exactly what Dana needed. "Your apartment is just old," he said, lounging on the couch. "You're freaking yourself out for no reason." But later, as they sat in the living room watching a movie, Alex suddenly went pale. "What's wrong?" Dana asked, following his gaze. I thought I saw someone standing in the hallway." Dana's stomach twisted. "Don't joke about that." "I'm not joking." They searched the apartment together, but there was no one there. Still, Alex left in a hurry, mumbling something about having to work early the next day. He never came back to visit. A week later, Dana woke to find a note on her kitchen counter. It hadn't been there the night before. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, as though written by someone with shaking hands. It read, "You're not alone." Her chest tightened. She called the landlord, demanding answers, but he brushed her off. "You're probably just stressed," he said. "City living takes some getting used to." Dana hung up and spent the rest of the day researching the building's history. What she found chilled her to the bone. There had been a string of disappearances tied to the apartment. Tenants who moved in and were never seen again. No bodies were ever found, but neighbors often reported hearing strange noises. Footsteps, whispers, the sound of doors slamming in the middle of the night. That night, Dana locked every door and window in the apartment. She left the lights on, hoping the brightness would keep the darkness at bay. At 3 a.m., she woke to a cold, skeletal hand wrapping around her ankle. Her scream caught in her throat as she yanked her leg away. The hand released her, but when she looked down, there was nothing there. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from an unknown number. "Don't leave me." She threw the phone across the room. The next morning, Dana packed a bag. She didn't care about the lease or the money she'd spent on the apartment. She just wanted to get out. But as she reached for the front door, she felt it again. Those cold, skeletal fingers, this time gripping her wrist. "Stay," a voice whispered, low and guttural. Dana screamed, pulling away with all her strength. She stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind her. She never returned. The landlord didn't seem surprised when Dana called to break the lease. He didn't argue or demand an explanation. He simply sighed and said, "I'll get the place cleaned up." 2 weeks later, he showed the apartment to a new tenant. "It's got a lot of charm," he said, unlocking the door. "A bit old, but that's part of the appeal." The young woman stepped inside, running her fingers over the walls. "It feels lived in," she said with a smile. The landlord nodded but didn't follow her into the apartment. Instead, he lingered in the hallway, his gaze fixed on the closed door. He didn't have the heart to tell her about the word etched into the dust-covered coffee table. "Stay." It was a cold, late autumn evening when Emma moved into the old creaky house at the edge of town. She had always dreamed of a quiet, peaceful life away from the noise and chaos of the city, and the thought of starting over in a secluded house seemed like the perfect solution. But as she stepped over the threshold, a shiver ran down her spine. Not from the chill in the air, but from a deeper, unsettling feeling that lingered in the old wooden beams of the house. She had never imagined that her dream of solitude would come at such a price. The house was an antique, the kind of place that had its own stories, whispers carried in the walls and the floorboards. The air smelled of dust and age, but also of something else, something faintly sweet and decayed. The moment she stepped inside, she felt the presence of something old, something hidden beneath the layers of time. She dismissed the feeling at first. It was just her imagination, she thought. After all, she had always been sensitive to the atmosphere of old places, and this house had certainly seen its fair share of years. The first night was quiet, a rare kind of stillness that was both comforting and oppressive. The wind howled outside, but inside the house there was no sound but the occasional creak of wood settling and the flickering of a candle as Emma tried to read in her new bedroom. As she lay in bed preparing for sleep, she felt a strange sensation creep over her. Her skin prickled, a sense of being watched, of being not quite alone. She turned toward the window, but nothing was there, only the shadows cast by the moonlight. Shaking her head, she pulled the covers tighter around her, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. "It's just the shadows," she whispered to herself. But when she pulled the blanket over her shoulder, a cold, clammy touch brushed against her skin. It was fleeting, like a hand passing too close, but it was enough to make her freeze. Her heart raced as her eyes darted around the room. There was no one there. Emma lay in silence, her mind racing. Could it have been the wind? Or maybe the old house was just settling, making sounds that seemed too real. But the touch, soft yet distinctly there, had left its mark. She felt it as though it had left a print on her skin, like a faint bruise where no one had touched her. She closed her eyes and tried to calm herself, but the sensation lingered, as though something was still there, just out of sight. The next morning, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. Her arm, where the phantom hand had brushed against her, was sore, the skin tender and bruised, though no visible mark could be seen. Emma searched the house, wondering if someone had entered while she slept. Perhaps the place wasn't as secure as she thought, but everything was in place. Nothing had been disturbed. There were no signs of an intruder, only that lingering feeling, the certainty that something was present, something unseen. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences only grew more frequent. The shadows seemed darker, deeper, as though they were beginning to shift on their own, moving closer with each passing day. Emma would wake in the night to find the blankets twisted around her legs, despite having gone to bed with them neatly pulled up. Occasionally she would hear faint whispers, voices too soft to make out, but distinct enough to know she wasn't imagining them. It wasn't just the shadows that troubled her. The touch, the cold, clammy hand, had become more frequent. It would appear unexpectedly, resting on her shoulder, brushing her arm. Sometimes just a fleeting sensation, other times with more pressure. Emma would spin around, her heart pounding in her chest, only to find nothing there, nothing but the oppressive silence of the house. But the touch, the feeling of fingers lingering on her skin, would stay long after the moment passed, like a mark that couldn't be erased. She tried to ignore it. She tried to tell herself that it was all in her head, that she was just tired, adjusting to the isolation of the house. But as the days wore on, Emma realized that something far darker was at play. The touch was not just physical, it was emotional too. It gnawed at her, twisting her thoughts, making her feel as though her very soul was being manipulated. The more it happened, the more she felt her grip on reality slipping, as though whatever was in the house was seeping into her very being. One evening, as she was cooking in the kitchen, she felt it again. A cold, clammy hand pressing gently against the back of her neck. She spun around, the knife in her hand trembling, but once again there was no one there. Just the flickering of the kitchen lights, casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The sensation of the hand lingered, wrapping itself around her thoughts, making her feel dizzy, nauseous. It wasn't just the touch, it was the presence of something else, something old and hungry. Emma could no longer pretend that everything was fine. She had to confront whatever it was that had been following her, touching her, tormenting her. One night, when the air felt particularly heavy, she stood in the middle of the living room and called out, her voice trembling but defiant. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What do you want from me?" There was no answer, only silence. But the temperature in the room dropped, and a cold wind rushed through the house, making the curtains flutter and sending a chill straight to her bones. Then, as if answering her challenge, the touch returned. This time it was stronger, more forceful. A hand gripped her wrist, pulling her toward the cold fireplace. The pain was immediate. The fingers that dug into her skin felt like ice, burning her with their coldness. Her breath caught in her throat, her legs buckling beneath her as the pressure became unbearable. Before she could scream, a voice, low, raspy, and filled with malice, whispered in her ear, "You invited me in." The words hit Emma like a physical blow, sending a wave of panic through her chest. She had bought the house in a rush, eager to escape her past, too eager to consider the warnings, too eager to see only the potential for peace. But now, standing there, she understood the truth. The house wasn't empty. It had always been waiting, and she had unknowingly opened the door, inviting whatever was trapped inside. In her final moments, Emma realized the truth. This wasn't just a ghost or a shadow. It was the house itself, its very very essence reaching out to claim her. The touch, the cold, suffocating grip, was not from an otherworldly entity. It was the house that had reached into her, its intangible fingers wrapping around her soul, pulling her into its dark, twisted embrace. The next morning, the neighbors found the house abandoned, empty. There was no sign of Emma, no trace of her disappearance. But in the corner of the living room where she had fallen to her knees, there were marks on the floor. Deep, etched scratches that seemed to spell out a single word: touch. The house stood silent, waiting once again. As the sun set behind it, casting long shadows over the yard, it was clear that it was ready. Ready for the next soul to step inside, ready to reach out with its cold, relentless touch and claim another victim. This expanded version of the story delves deeper into Emma's growing fear and the increasing intensity of the hauntings. It builds up the tension and suspense more gradually, with a slower descent into madness. The final twist reveals that the house itself is the true antagonist, creating a chilling conclusion that leaves readers pondering the true nature of the haunting. It began innocently enough. A single email tucked amidst the usual stream of junk Jenna scrolled past each morning. The subject line, human touch, an experiment in connection, barely registered with her until she hovered over it. Normally, she wouldn't have given it a second thought, but something about those words struck a chord. Maybe it was the phrasing. Maybe it was the fact that she'd spent another night scrolling through her phone, feeling more disconnected than ever. She clicked on it, mostly out of curiosity. The message was brief, almost clinical. In an age of screens, we've forgotten what it means to connect. Physical touch is dying. We're conducting an experiment to rediscover its importance. Join us. It wasn't even signed. No company name, no details. Just a button labeled, "Sign up here." Jenna laughed under her breath and closed the email. It had to be a scam, probably some phishing attempt to steal her data. Still, she didn't delete it. A week later, her inbox pinged again. The subject line read, "We noticed you didn't sign up, Jenna." Her stomach twisted slightly. How did they know her name? She stared at the screen, debating whether to open it. Against her better judgment, she clicked. "Jenna, don't you want to feel connected? Click here to join. Physical touch is more important than ever." She shivered, quickly closing the email. It was probably just an algorithm pulling her name from somewhere. That was how marketing worked these days, right? But as she sat back in her chair, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. That night, she woke suddenly, heart racing. At first, she thought it was a noise, maybe the clatter of a neighbor in the apartment next door. But then she felt it. A faint pressure, barely there, brushed against the back of her neck. It was warm, almost like the ghost of a hand. She bolted upright in bed, spinning around. Her bedroom was empty. "Just a dream," she whispered, her voice trembling in the silence. She got up to check the locks on her door and windows, even though she knew she'd secured them before bed. Everything was in place. Still, the sensation lingered. She could almost feel the phantom hand resting just above her skin. The next email arrived 2 days later. "How did the touch feel, Jenna?" Her breath caught as she stared at the screen. She slammed her laptop shut, her pulse hammering in her ears. It wasn't possible. No one knew what had happened. For the rest of the day, she tried to convince herself it was a coincidence, a trick of her imagination. But deep down, she knew better. The touches became more frequent after that. At first, it was subtle, a light brush against her arm as she sat on the couch, the sensation of fingers slipping through her hair when she was alone in the bathroom. She told herself it was stress, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But then they grew bolder. One night as she showered, she felt it, a hand squeezing her shoulder. She screamed, stumbling backward, her foot slipping on the wet tile. When she spun around, there was nothing there. The bathroom was empty. Her phone buzzed the next morning. Another email. "Don't you see, Jenna? Human touch is vital. Tell us how it feels." She didn't delete this one. Instead, she forwarded it to the police. When she called to explain, the officer on the line sounded skeptical but polite. "We'll look into it, ma'am," he said. By the time she hung up, she felt even more alone. The touches escalated. They came during the day now, not just at night. Jenna began locking herself in her bedroom, piling furniture against the door. It didn't matter. The sensations found her anyway. One afternoon while she worked at her desk, she felt fingers slide across her cheek. She froze, her breath catching. Slowly, she turned her head. Nothing. When she looked back at her screen, a new email had appeared, even though she hadn't heard the notification. "We're here for you, Jenna. Don't be afraid to connect." She tried to tell her coworker Rachel over coffee. "You're just stressed," Rachel said with a sympathetic smile. "I mean, you're working crazy hours, living alone. It's probably all in your head." Jenna wanted to argue, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? That invisible hands were touching her? That she was being stalked by something she couldn't see? Then the video arrived. It was late at night when her phone buzzed. The email had no subject line, just an attachment labeled, "Watch." Her hand trembled as she clicked. The video opened to a grainy, black and white recording of her bedroom. The footage showed her sleeping, her body twisting under the sheets. At first, nothing happened. Then a shadow crept into the frame. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, bending in unnatural ways. It moved with an eerie fluidity, as though its joints were made of liquid. The shadow reached out, its hand resting on her shoulder. In the video, Jenna stirred but didn't wake. Slowly, the shadow's fingers seemed to sink into her skin, like smoke dissipating into her body. The video ended. Her phone buzzed again. A new email. "Do you understand now, Jenna? Human touch is necessary." Jenna packed her things that night. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. She grabbed her keys, threw her bag over her shoulder, and headed for the door. Her phone buzzed. "You can't run from connection, Jenna. We'll find you." She froze, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. Then she felt it, a hand gripping her wrist, hard enough to leave red marks. She screamed, dropping her bag and running into the bathroom. Locking the door, she sank to the floor, clutching a knife she'd grabbed from the kitchen. She stayed there all night, listening to the sound of her own breathing. By morning, the marks on her wrist had vanished. Jenna tried everything after that, changing her email, smashing her laptop, moving to a new apartment. But it didn't matter. The touches followed her. In the subway, she'd feel an icy hand slip into hers, the grip cold and unfamiliar. In the grocery store, fingers would brush her back, making her spin around in panic. She started avoiding people, convinced they couldn't see what was happening. The final email arrived a month after it began. "We've taught you the importance of touch, Jenna. Now it's your turn." Attached was a new link. When she clicked, the screen displayed a single prompt. "Enter the name and address of the next participant." Her hands shook as she tried to close the browser, but her fingers wouldn't obey. Tears streamed down her face as she typed the name of her coworker, Rachel. That night, for the first time in weeks, Jenna slept peacefully. Rachel didn't show up for work the next day, and Jenna's phone buzzed with a new email. "Thank you, Jenna. Human touch is spreading." The rain was relentless that evening, hammering down like the sky was trying to drown the earth. Mara adjusted the hood of her jacket and tightened her grip on the umbrella as she walked briskly toward her apartment. The wet streets reflected neon lights from the few open shops, but even those small signs of life were disappearing as the hour grew later. She hated working the late shift at the diner, less because of the hours and more because of the walk home and through the deserted streets. Tonight, however, felt different. In the small, unassuming town of Graywood, nestled between misty hills and ancient oak forests, life moved at a quiet, predictable pace. The townsfolk, friendly but private, often spoke in hushed tones about the old Victorian house at the edge of the woods. It belonged to Clara Langley, a young woman known for her generosity and kindness. Clara had inherited the creaking, ivy-covered house from her grandfather, who had passed away 2 years prior. Though the townsfolk whispered about the house being cursed, strange sounds, flickering lights, and unexplained drafts, Clara dismissed it. It was just an old house, she reasoned. She spent most of her time alone, tending to her garden, knitting by the fireplace, or reading dusty books left behind by her grandfather. Occasionally, a neighbor or friend would drop by for help. Clara was known for never turning anyone away, whether it was patching clothes, mending broken trinkets, or simply lending an ear. She always obliged. But in recent weeks, the house had begun to feel different. She couldn't explain it, but there was a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched. At night, shadows seemed to move where they shouldn't, and the creaks of the house sounded more like footsteps. Even the familiar ticking of her grandfather's old clock had taken on a hollow, mournful tone. She tried to ignore it. After all, what else could she do? The knock at the door. It was a bitterly cold October night when it happened. Rain lashed against the windows, the wind howling like a living thing. Clara sat in her armchair by the fireplace, knitting a scarf for a neighbor's child. The warmth of the fire wrapped around her like a protective cocoon, but the feeling of unease lingered. The knock came suddenly, sharp and deliberate. Clara froze, her knitting needles pausing mid-stitch. No one ever visited her this late, especially not in weather like this. For a moment she considered ignoring it, but the knock came again, louder this time, almost insistent. She set her knitting aside and walked to the door, her slippers scuffing softly against the wooden floor. Peering through the peephole, she saw a man standing on her porch, soaked to the bone. "Who is it?" she called through the door, her hand hesitating on the doorknob. "I'm sorry to bother you," the man said, his voice muffled by the rain. "My car broke down just up the road. Could I use your phone to call for help?" Clara hesitated. Something about the man's voice was wrong. It was soft, almost too soft. Yet there was a strained edge to it, like he was forcing calmness, but the kindness ingrained in her won out. She opened the door. The man was pale, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He looked cold and desperate, his hands trembling as he stood there in the downpour. "Please, come in," Clara said, stepping aside. The man stepped into the house, water dripping from his coat and pooling on the floor. He looked around with a peculiar intensity, his sunken eyes scanning every corner of the room. "Thank you," he said, his voice flat. Not everyone would open their door to a stranger. Clara forced a polite smile. "There's a phone in the kitchen," she said, gesturing down the hallway. The man nodded but didn't move right away. Instead, he lingered, his gaze lingering on her face. "You're very kind," he said after a moment. Then, without another word, he disappeared down the hall. The first sign. Clara returned to her chair by the fire, trying to shake off her unease. She picked up her knitting, but her hands trembled too much to continue. Something about the man unnerved her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Minutes passed and the house grew eerily quiet. She realized she hadn't heard the man make his call. "Everything all right?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No response. Setting her knitting aside, Clara stood and made her way to the kitchen. The room was empty. The phone sat untouched on the counter. "Hello?" she called again, louder this time. Her voice echoed through the empty house, then from behind her, she heard it. "I'm sorry, I got a little turned around." She spun around to see the man standing in the doorway, his wet clothes dripping onto the floor. He was too close, his presence unnervingly large in the small space. "I didn't hear you make your call," Clara said, taking a step back. The man smiled faintly, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "I guess I forgot. Do you mind if I sit by the fire for a bit? Just to warm up." Something inside Clara screamed at her to say no, but the words wouldn't come. She nodded stiffly. "Sure, I'll grab you a blanket." the touch. When Clara returned to the living room, the man was sitting in her chair by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames. His hands rested on his knees, and she noticed for the first time how unnaturally long his fingers were, as though they didn't quite belong to him. She handed him the blanket, careful not to let their fingers touch. Here you go. The man took it without a word, but as the fabric brushed against his skin, Clara noticed something strange. His hands were bone-dry despite the rain. "Is there someone I can call for you?" she asked, desperate to break the silence. The man looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "No, there's no one." The words hung in the air like a threat. Clara took a step back. "I think you should leave now." The man didn't move. Instead, he stood slowly, the blanket slipping to the floor. His presence seemed to fill the room, the air thick and suffocating. "Do you believe in favors, Clara?" he asked, his tone almost conversational. "What?" "Favors," he repeated, stepping closer. "Kindnesses. They always come with a price, don't they?" Clara's breath hitched. "I don't understand." His eyes locked into hers, and for the first time she realized they weren't hollow. They were endless, a black void that seemed to stretch into eternity. "You invited me in," he said softly, "and now I need one more favor." He reached for her, his hand brushing her arm. The moment his skin touched hers, Clara felt a jolt of pain so intense it stole her breath. Her vision blurred, and the world twisted and warped around her. The aftermath. When Clara came to, she was alone. The fire had gone out, the room plunged into darkness. Her head throbbed, and her arm burned where the man had touched her. She stumbled to the mirror above the fireplace and gasped. A black, blistered handprint marred her skin, pulsing faintly as though alive. Over the next few days, the mark spread. It crept up her arm like a shadow, leaving the skin beneath it numb and lifeless. Clara tried to hide it, but the whispers began. She heard them at night, faint and insistent, growing louder with each passing day. Soon, Clara stopped leaving the house altogether. The once warm glow of her home became cold and uninviting, the shadows stretching longer and darker. And then, one by one, the townsfolk began to disappear. No one saw Clara again. Her house stood empty, its windows dark and uninviting. But on stormy nights, some claimed to see a light flickering in the window and a figure standing on the porch, waiting for the next kind soul to let her in.